Welcome back to the fun situation with the Creative Assembly. After quite a long time of concern simmering, it's really just bubbled over. We've had the cancellation of Hyenas, the whole story behind that, Voland doing some leaks from his sources, then Creative Assembly DMCAing him, that entire thing, then Total War Pharaoh, of course, coming out and having, to be honest, rather pitiful numbers on Steam. All of this has led to a fan base that, be it the historical fans or the fantasy fans, I think have just about had enough. I've been playing Total War games since I first picked up Rome 1 back in like 2005. I absolutely have got a horse in this race, and I certainly get how it feels firsthand, how the pace of innovation for major gameplay features, the likes of AI, has just completely flatlined. Now, as a response to all of this, quite a few Creative Assembly staff have been getting rather leaky. They have leaked to Voland, people have been in Legend of Total War's chat, I've had an email and a bunch of people in my comments claiming to be CA devs. There's stuff we've been able to corroborate. So today it's time to bring everything together and to work out, is there any hope? What sort of things could we expect to change? And broadly, what is the future of the Total War franchise going to look like? In terms of quotes from staff, we're mostly going off what was said to Voland. In addition to that, I've been contacted by people and I've corroborated where possible. So overall, I do think that this is a fairly realistic picture of what is going on, at the very least from the perspective of one camp at people at the company. As an example, if you were to take Blizzard Entertainment, a few people in the World of Warcraft development team have spoke to me, and I very much understand their frustrations. A lot of their frustrations match up with those of the player base. However, I also know that's a team of 700 people, and quite a lot of people on that team would not agree with the people who have spoken to me. So take it with a grain of salt. With that said, supposedly, Total War has essentially ended up becoming a real cash cow for Creative Assembly, with Creative Assembly being basically the big, good, profitable studio for Sega. The franchise regularly is getting from 2 to 3 million copies per release. Here's the quote: "Before Hyenas, I was told Creative Assembly was Sega's most profitable studio because of this." So basically, it's successful, but also, I mean, where's Paradox with their real-time combat in a grand strategy game? That basically means that they have their own little niche of the market carved out, and there's not really much in the way of hard competition to basically innovate. As an example, if someone came and did better real-time combat than Total War, a lot of people in the historical setting would actually move over, and to be honest with you, it wouldn't be too hard for them to be topped, as you'll kind of see as we keep on going. Now, per an email that we received from somebody claiming to be a developer, and I did, look around LinkedIn and stuff, seemed to actually match up. Long-term planning around the creation of Shogun 2 was built around the idea that the Total War player base was not growing. Now, for anybody who is owned by a listed company like Sega, the lack of growth in terms of users is going to be a worrying thing. That means, well, how are you going to grow your revenue? Obviously by getting more money per customer. Since then, one fairly major thing did change, and that is access to the Warhammer franchise. I think Warhammer's probably expanded Total War quite a bit, so at this time around Shogun 2, we're mostly talking about within the historical niche, that fan base not growing massively. That being said, a lot of game discovery platforms, the likes of Steam, YouTube, etc., they're a lot more powerful than they were back in the days when Shogun 2 first came out, where yes, we were reading game sites, but also the likes of, say, buying an issue of PC Gamer were actually a fairly regular thing to do. Because of that, aided on by the rise of a lot of what Paradox has been doing, I do think that that audience would grow. But again, I don't have the data, what would I know? Basically, the story is that management and Sega needed to make more money. They needed to improve their revenue per user. So what happened was an intent to have a Total War game every single year with DLC being attached. This is per one of Voland's sources. The plan was to create DLC content with a dedicated team, quote, churning out reskins of old shit to peddle money for old rope. The intended games for this plan were Shogun 2, Rome 2, and more small historical games in familiar settings. Now, for those of us who are aware of those historical games, well, yeah, we pretty much know that's like Thrones of Britannia, which was pretty much just Attila. It did a few nice little innovations, but it was an Attila campaign expansion, let's be real. Of course, Troy then did that for, I think, was it Warhammer 2 that it spawned off? And then obviously Pharaoh is, it's it's kind of try again. That's what a lot of people have essentially realized. Most notably, though, smaller historicals basically means no Medieval 3, no, say, Rome 3, or another Empire-like title. It's just going to be those smaller settings. And what this essentially meant is getting more product out, basically more content. As, yes, Bill Gates wrote in the 90s, content is king. However, in the games industry, innovation is also content. You can only keep on pumping content out for so long until people just get sick of it, until the amount of problems accrue and you need to actually clear your technical debt, finish your problems, and innovate in the core of your game. And that essentially is the thing that has been sacrificed at the altar of very regular releases with a lot of DLC. So overall then, we've not really had space for expanding historicals. There's been no new space for, like, say, newer game mechanics. As an example, it's the naval battles in Empire took years to develop and basically could no longer be justified as a thing worth doing. Of course, you look at a lot of Total War games and they basically don't really bother with the naval bit as much. In fairness, some people love those, some people didn't. I certainly remember around the time Empire was coming out, I was fairly mind blown by just how impressive the feature was. There's been a lot of people looking for the likes of, say, a First World War title, which, you could sort of see from Fall of the Samurai, move up a little bit from that. Apparently, there have been some leaks and rumors that was at one point in the works. But again, any large leaps forward are essentially not happening per all of this. The historical side of their franchise has just doubled down on those smaller releases. Meanwhile, of course, the fantasy element of the franchise is there. Their intent was to license existing IP and to bring in new players. In addition to this, though, we have another team at Creative Assembly, the console team. Basically, the console team were being given additional focus by management, despite a feeling on the Total War team that, quote, Total War paid for the console team. So from the emailer's perspective, right, Creative Assembly was never equipped to be agile or responsive. If there had have been pushback sooner, like, internally, then maybe they would have been forced to change. Maybe some things would have ended up being a bit better. But basically, Total War was raking in the money. There were problems, they didn't need to be fixed because the money was still coming in, it was a fairly captive audience, and when you have a content pipeline that is that absolutely stuffed full of content, guess what? It's a big ship, and it turns fairly slowly. So the idea then of a company with a beloved franchise that is desperately trying to get its other plays to be successful, does that remind you of anything? This is where I can talk about a few things that I've heard from sources at Blizzard. Basically, if you ever wanted, like, player housing in World of Warcraft, any of those things, all very solvable problems. Essentially, the problem is Blizzard did not invest in their core technologies for World of Warcraft. They didn't invest in slicing away that technical debt until far too late, which then means you have a content team that feels like they sort of have their hands tied behind their back, not able to really make the most crazy, interesting, or just new innovative features because they're being held back by tools, by pipelines, by processes. And this is another thing that we see here. Because at the end of the day, if Total War is only getting 2 to 3 million sales, how do you move up to the next level? The answer to that apparently was Hyenas, which was allegedly Sega's most expensive title, costing $70 million and being an utter shit show from the perspective of its development, which has of course led to many people leaking. Okay, let's talk about the decision makers then. One thing that's been clear as we've went across the various places that staff have been talking, be it my email inbox, Voland, and other people, and I would say, hey, if you are at CA and you feel like this is unfair, if you feel like you have some additional context, anything that would help get reality, get truth out there, truth is what I'm interested in, let me know. You can hit up tips@bellular.games, and that'll land in my inbox. And yeah, we can have a chat, we can see what's going on, and if there's any major changes, obviously I'll update the audience on that. Okay, so the brand team essentially gets quite a lot of blame here. Essentially, the brand team is a sort of overarching production team who manage individual elements of a wider studio. It seems that each brand has a lead responsible for it. As an example, if we were to use Blizzard, you'd have a Warcraft manager, a Diablo manager, that kind of thing. Now, allegedly, these are the people who get most of the say in what's actually made. They're the people who go to Sega and actually do the pitching and come home with the big old sack of cash. Now, this is not a new thing for a company. This is actually how the vision for a game is often created, right? Like the vision, the life cycle, the budget. The word specifically in the Voland video that was given was the Bible for a game. Yeah, your game's Bible. That is a very, very common common thing across the industry. Go to any Gamescom, see people pitching their games. That is exactly the sort of thing that'll be going on. I mean, in 30-minute publisher speed dating, you're not going to whip out your Bible, but hey, you get the drift. The point here basically is that it's the big brand managers who are making a lot of these major decisions, right? And the allegation here is that this is why, partially, there's a lot of bad decisions. That these are basically people mostly concerned with top-level studio, essentially finances and that kind of thing. They're holding the purse strings. They're also the people who are trying to increase the revenue per user, per product, while then seemingly imposing some creative and production limitations as a result of this decision-making. Here's a quote. 9 out of 10 times, if there's a bad decision that's been received poorly by the community, it's driven by a marketing strategy. Intel modes in Warhammer, exclusive contracts with Epic. Remember Troy, who's just for free in the Epic store when it came out? That was bizarre. DLC price increases. Of course, that's been the most recent drama, other than Pharaoh. These are basically all things from this brand department, and it all tracks with the broad idea that they're not really increasing the size of their player base, therefore they have to monetize them more deeply, and this all basically comes down to risk mitigation, keeping that bottom line happy. I would love to know how much Epic Games paid them for that whole Troy thing. Now, there's one man who's came up in all of this, and that guy is Rob Bartholomew. It's quite interesting. He's the Chief Product Officer, and I imagine he's going to have a few awkward days at the office, because a lot of the staff who have leaked have talked about, disagreeing with him specifically, right? That he's basically being framed as the money man. Here's a quote. In company meetings, Rob used to present us with these charts illustrating game sales and how they compare to one another. The total sales of tentpole releases don't fluctuate much, so the key to boosting profits is to raise the average spend per player. Personally, I don't think DLC is inherently problematic, but it often feels like Total War DLC has become a rather cynical method of achieving this goal at this point. That's the sort of thing. Personally, if you said to me, hey, here's a game that you absolutely love, we're going to make DLC for it for 5 or 6 years. In a way, I'd be pretty happy. It would be a bit like playing an MMO with the safety that, oh, your MMO is going to have 3 more expansions, loads of content updates, and you feel like you're not playing in something that's a dead end. Of course, once the ask of money to quality of released content or quantity of released content no longer makes sense, that's when, you're getting more money out of people, so obviously they're going to start holding you to a higher and a higher standard. But then the question is, what if this is happening at the expense of the long term? And I suppose this is where I get interested in things. Take a game like, say, Dark Souls, and I know it's the most trite thing in the universe to bring up Dark Souls in a video about gaming. Dark Souls, right? Pretty damn successful. Kept on going more successful. Elden Ring, quite a bit more ambitious. Really helped to just, along with obviously that franchise becoming more known, Elden Ring definitely with like its scope, its marketing, its public positioning, it was able to get a lot more people interested in that type of game as compared to, say, a Sekiro-like game. So there's always that thing where, like, yes, your game has got its audience, but how are you going to bring that to the absolute next level? And I think the answer there is your Empire 2 or your Medieval 3 being genuinely a next generation ahead, right? As an example, I know a shitload of people who played loads of Medieval 2 in university. They don't touch it right now. They're kind of done with it. I know for a fact, if there was, say, a Medieval 3, and it didn't feel like just a reskin of Warhammer 3, that those people would be back. If you had a Medieval 3 that was truly innovative in a bunch of its mechanics, that had radically better AI, the sorts of things that, yes, are long-term engineering projects, but the sorts of projects that are worth doing because they'll massively increase what you can do in the future, which of course you would think is good for revenue. That being said, if your content pipeline is so brutal that you never get the time to build anything for the future, then you really do have a problem. And that's where we've got to talk about technical debt. If you've been playing this franchise, then even if you do not know what the word technical debt means from a software engineering perspective, I'm pretty sure you can almost definitely feel the vibe from actually playing these games. We received a message from an ex-dev at Creative Assembly who had worked on games from Attila until some unreleased projects, and also had some feedback for us on how we had presented things in our last video. So, one bit of information, I really do appreciate them reaching out. The scope of 3 Kingdoms was far larger than we had implied. It's quite interesting, actually. Yes, here's the quote. In terms of design and code, it was bigger than Warhammer 1 and Warhammer 2, and comparable to Warhammer 3. that definitely is, yeah, that's fairly interesting to know. Thinking about that game systemically, yes, diplomacy, resources, a lot of that was actually way better than we had seen in past Total War games. According to one of Volan's sources, that was allegedly so they could get a little bit of that kind of like Paradox game energy in. Also, of course, you had the Records mode, you had the like Romance of the Three Kingdoms mode. It's entirely possible that because I wasn't really interested in the Romance of the Three Kingdoms mode and I was just there for a historical setting, that I probably under-indexed that and then underappreciated its impact on development. So that was definitely interesting to hear. Now, this developer described how Troy forked from the Warhammer 2 codebase and how Sophia then, in majority, has handled both it and Pharaoh, especially Pharaoh. Of course, it's that situation where, looking around the Total War community, I don't think anybody is looking at Sophia and saying that they're doing a bad job. When you look at Troy and you look at Pharaoh, when it comes to them operating within the parameters that they've been given, it really does seem that they do everything they can. If you look at the changes to the battle map that are going on in Pharaoh to still get us like some more depth, interactivity, of course dealing with how this is, a Bronze Age setting, there's not really as much unit diversity. They really did try as hard as they can, so it's absolutely not their fault. But to go back to the core development issue, essentially there hasn't really been a big centralized engine. Essentially, games are just built off forks of other games. Now, what we mean there is that, yes, like there is the Total War engine, right? There is Creative Assembly's engine, sets of tools, and all of that. They will essentially fork off a project, start the new project, fork off that project, start a new project, and that will keep on happening. And yes, some improvements will be folded back into the dough as time goes on. However, what this is a recipe for something in the industry we call technical debt, which is basically, hey, that slapdash fix you made 18 months ago on another project that got folded back into the code? Yeah, well, congratulations, it just broke. And then you've got to go and fix that. Or just patch it up because in reality, you've got to ship features and content for the new game, so there's not really much of an ability to go back and to properly spend the engineering time to just, refactor a bunch of shit, actually make it run good. So essentially, it's hodgepodge versions, things being forked off other things. Warhammer is a derivative of Attila, which is seemingly the case for all Total War games. They fork off each other. There is no distinct engine and game because everything is just so customized. Quote, in recent years, they've been trying to tease out a game engine from the codebase, but as far as I know, they haven't got very far. Warhammer 1 is based on the Rome 2 engine. Then that is required to interface with 2 sequels, 2 new storefront infrastructures for multiplayer, a new DLC/live service backend, and Immortal Empires. Which, when you think about it, is mad. Quote, it's a miracle this thing works at all, and it's a testament to the skill and persistence of the Total War programmers that keep the whole show on the road. Warhammer 3 now limps on with this legacy, making any new updates, new content, or bug fixes is extremely difficult. The codebase is creaking at the seams, so much tech debt accumulated, no time to fix it. This isn't an excuse. The time should have been made. Now, in the run-up to patch 1.0.2 of Warhammer 3, they actually acknowledge that. They said, and really this is a problem for so many live games. We've seen rumors about even like Bungie having problems with this kind of thing when it comes to Destiny. Obviously, Destiny is a game that's been creaking a little bit since Lightfall, with a lot of server issues and that sort of thing. But yes, basically they weren't able to give a firm date for this patch because it's a very complex game, and they said if we change one thing, it can have an unexpected impact somewhere else in the game, which I think just highlights the impact of this technical debt. Because this is all just forks of forks of forks, and they haven't really had the time to actually consolidate, basically they can't build in-depth proper solutions to problems because they're building on top of a mountain of existing problems. It's always that thing in code where short-term expediency to hit a date, whatever it is, that can just lead to something being done fast, not necessarily perfect. We learn from the sources that they're not investing proper time in engine and tools, so implementing changes is complex, it's costly. Quote, most in-house engines are like this to a degree, it's not the worst I've seen, but the poor tools come up in almost every postmortem. They always say they'll do something about it really this time. Each game being a fork of a previous one means that most of the features are just modified versions of existing ones. It's a slow evolution. If you've played these games, I mean, this is pretty goddamn obvious to you when you actually think about how things would be working. For our next point then, the impact of developers, because, hey, let's say you have loads and loads and loads of manufacturing lines for cars, but you need to make a really core change to the car. Oh dear, all those staff have got to stop. All of those lines have to stop. You're in deep shit. It's not exactly what's going on, but you'll see that it's somewhat similar. So this is from the developer who worked on Attila that messaged us. They talked a little bit about how these games are actually made. Attila, Warhammer 1 through 3, and Three Kingdoms were all mostly the same teams for code, with some crossover for art and audio, but hard split in terms of design teams for historical and fantasy games. The studio allegedly went from 280 to 900 people during this time, and that the studio was subject to intense growing pains. I mean, come on, you don't slightly more than like triple your workforce without there being severe issues. That's pretty mind-blowing. Now, in this developer's perspective, it's not like the whole thing is screwed. There are loads of good developers there, but there are growing pains. They are in a rough patch. I think then some of the other sources that have spoken to other people would probably chime in about long-term project planning and that sort of thing. We will obviously see. But what this does do is give me some additional context to Volan's sources, who describe a patchwork approach to development that does not allow for long-term planning, which, hey, I suppose we've all felt when we play these games. So you've got the game teams for major titles like Warhammer 3 or Pharaoh. This includes sub-teams within those ones who will be focusing on DLC sets and ongoing maintenance. Then you have some non-game teams. These will be teams such as tools, rendering, engines, right? That kind of thing. Basically people who should be project agnostic because they are more building the machine that's building the machine, or I suppose that the machine is being built on. Now, the idea with them is that they are supposed to be ensuring that the code is good and, that a lot of these problems we've been talking about aren't really happening. The problem seems to be, though, that so many problems crop up through development with how relentless this pipeline is that these teams, rather than actually having the time to fix problems properly, they're more being treated as an emergency resource, right? Basically grabbed in to help with, emergency periods, which is kind of happening every year, which then means that they don't actually get to fix any of the big problems. Of course, that means that if you've been maybe a bit worried about the stagnation, it's like, we do have new campaign mechanics, new little rule sets, things like that are not going to be as complex as a big, crazy new thing, but a lot of those fundamental, truly hard to solve problems, like your AI and various other things, well, I don't know, it kind of seems that those are just by the wayside because there's not time to do them when the bloody games almost don't work. Now, going to talk to us, it's very clear that this is a situation that's taking its toll on team members, who are of course often very proud of what they can accomplish under these conditions. And I think that is the most sad thing. When projects are kind of catching fire like this, that often means that individual people at those companies have got to rise to a crazy challenge and grind really damn hard. Yes, that may be to produce something that you, a customer, are not particularly happy with, but that's not really the fault of that developer or even necessarily that developer's team. A lot of people here would seemingly say that that is the fault of the brand team, the people who are doing the long-term planning. But you may think, with the community being so vocal for so many years, why has there not been change? So let's talk about that. It seems pretty clear that the community around Total War and the studio they created have got fairly different ideas of what the word community actually means. As an example, the Great Book of Grudges was interviewing some ex-CA staff. Here's one. I genuinely believe that CA has a little bit of a culture problem when it comes to interacting with the community, and this is also present internally, where people don't necessarily show the necessary respect to customers. Again, for one of Volan's sources, they're not taking criticism seriously as a factor for change, but they're also not particularly keen on reviews being negative. They talk a little bit about whenever there's a big, uptick in negative reviews, that they'll do what they can to basically petition Steam to remove invalid reviews. Now, that's something that, broadly speaking, from what I'm aware of, is pretty damn ineffective. At least talking about this from the developer's perspective, you can leave a developer comment on a review, and you can also flag a review to Valve. That will be if the review is doing something that's breaking their platform terms of service. I don't really think I've ever heard of that being necessarily super effective, though. Then again, It's not like I've been keeping tabs on the exact reviews on a game like Pharaoh to see if any of those reviews are disappearing. But of course, when a community hears something like that from people who are, leaking from a company, allegedly, that is going to be fairly rough. The overall implication is that CA don't exactly care about the community. They basically care about creators who can be useful to them and people who will buy their games. To a point, you can understand that, but when you do that to the point where you start to restrict your customer base, then you got a problem. They are honestly quite legendary in their willingness to blacklist creators. And I don't mean blacklist people because of something that they've done that's really bad or something they've said that's super distasteful. I just mean blacklist because they didn't like the game. They had protracted negative feedback, that sort of thing. As an example, I have been really, really harsh on Blizzard, fairly regularly, and their community team haven't broken off contact at all, right? They generally just seem to be yeah, that's your opinion, you can take it. I know that if I was even approaching 20% of that with Creative Assembly, I would be on the blacklist, which, if I tried to get with them, obviously, I would not get into their creator program. Not that I would even want to. Now, this was all made a bit worse because people reached out to Voland regarding the cancellation of Hyenas, and they DMCA takedowned his video. Now, this was prompted by the leak of a proprietary tonal video for Hyenas that was made by film director Neil Blomkamp during the game's development. Re-uploads were then targeted for DMCA strikes, and Voland's video was alleged to contain the video, so it was struck. He appealed, and YouTube correctly identified that the video was being used for journalistic purposes and that the complaint would not be upheld. The whole thing is honestly quite ridiculous. Honestly, I was surprised CA actually went that hard on that one. But basically, the feeling here is that they're hostile to a fault. Now, this thing about DMCAs, Legend of Total War, I believe it was on Twitter, but he called them out for this not being cool, right? He didn't support DMCAing, obviously against the purpose of what a DMCA takedown is supposed to be for. And then he basically said, yep, I have been blacklisted. Now, of course, he's been blacklisted in the past, and it's funny because when I think about the strategy gamers that I follow, I actually think more of them are blacklisted by Creative Assembly than are not, which is fairly concerning. Now, it was interesting for Legend, so he got blacklisted back in 2018. He made a video, "You guys are awesome, I need to be better from now on," where he kind of talked about things, and yes, he ended up getting back on that. However, he's now out of that partner program. But what is, I think, particularly interesting is this. A staffer said, when Warhammer 3 was in development, they crossed out feedback from some creators. This is creators who are part of the partner program. As in Legend, his comments were usually redacted. Now, these comments being redacted, I suppose, before they're properly getting to developers, that is completely insane. Legend then says that this completely flies in the face of what Creative Assembly actually told him during early access, so he's basically saying they're being very duplicitous towards me. They just wanted me there to market the game, and that's not what I wanted, so they 100% lied. I suppose this is different understandings of what the word partner means in that program, where for CA it's just, you're going to promote our game. For some other people, they would actually treat it as being, actually partnership. And indeed, there are many games companies now who do have community summits with community creators, with professional players, that kind of thing. I mean, even within Electronic Arts for games like Dead Space and some of their upcoming titles, they basically have a community council thing going so they can check in with the more the hardcore or invested fans, which certainly seems to be a good idea and really doesn't seem to be the Creative Assembly way of doing things. Overall, then, it's a funny tale. It's one that they should actually be aware of. Their games are about the rising and falling of empires. I mean, come on, do a little bit of thinking. Usually, it's because of complacency and forms of chaos, right? So, that's essentially what's going on. From my perspective, hey, Rome 2 content, anything there? Medieval 3? Could that potentially ever be a thing? Empire 2, could that potentially ever be a thing? Are we going to see that type of innovation? I think that those larger games, look at what they've got with these 3 Warhammer games. Yes, it would be an absolutely mammoth task doing Medieval 3. And you know what? Even if they did Medieval 3 and you essentially had Europe, and, you know, maybe you didn't have some other regions. I think perhaps people would buy that, right? Maybe with the understanding, and this is, I suppose, where their desire for the recurring revenue would come in, where, yes, you could maybe build that over time, where, yes, it's less ground being covered in a single individual game, but we also must remember that compared to a game like, say, Medieval 1, the level of graphical fidelity that it was created at, it is a hell of a lot more work. Like, if you're to make a Medieval 3 that covers as much as Medieval 2, while also taking every part of that game forward and adding in new mechanics, that is going to be significantly larger, I would imagine, than, say, I don't know, the development period of 3K. Now, for people to get truly excited about Total War again, that might be what they need. And some would say that, yes, you may take a little bit of a short-term hit. You may have some weaker quarters, maybe a weaker fiscal year, because you're not going to have another release. And he would then say, but because you've done that hard work, you'll be set up for really nice revenue in the future. Again, it's very easy to do armchair business, but I always do just wonder, how can short-termism go on for so long in a world where nobody was truly trying to be competition to Total War? Well, where do they put the extra money? Not in making Total War bigger, in trying to open up a second front in the war via Hyenas, which obviously failed. If that Hyenas money went into a Medieval 3, I really do have to wonder where we would be. Who knows? Well, the answer probably is creative assembly staff, and yeah, they seem to be in a talkative mood these days. Okay, that's it for today's video. This is fascinating, and to me a little bit sad, because hey, this is one of my favorite franchises of all time, and it's pretty sad to see how things have been going. Ah well, Legend's doing more historical Total War content, so I suppose we've won a little bit out of this. That's it from me. I'll see you next time.